This was meant to be the beginning of our life together, our honeymoon, the trip of a lifetime. Ethan and I had dreamed of exploring the English countryside with its rolling hills and ancient stone buildings, and when we found the mansion perched on the cliffs in Devon, it seemed perfect. A 3-night stay in a grand old house overlooking the sea, isolated, peaceful, and romantic. Now, as I sit here alone in the middle of the night, my hands shaking as I write, I'm afraid we should never have come. I'm afraid that we won't make it through the night. We arrived earlier this evening just as the storm rolled in. The journey had been long, and the weather grew worse the closer we got. By the time we pulled up the winding drive to the mansion, the rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing, slamming against the car with fury. The headlights caught glimpses of the stone facade of the mansion through the downpour, a looming structure, dark and ancient, with ivy crawling up the weathered walls. It seemed to grow out of the cliffside itself, as though it had been born of the very rock. We were both soaked by the time we reached the door, where a tall man stood waiting. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrow, the caretaker, and his presence unsettled me immediately. His pale skin seemed almost translucent, his eyes cold and colorless. He did not smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," he greeted us in a voice like wet gravel. "We've been expecting you." Something in the way he said "we" sent a shiver down my spine. There was no one else here, not another soul for miles, but I brushed it off as my nerves from the storm. I smiled politely, gripping Ethan's arm for warmth and reassurance. The mansion's interior was as grand as we had imagined, stone floors, high ceilings, and large, dusty portraits lining the hallways. It was a self-catering accommodation, so Mr. Harrow left us with the keys and disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps barely audible as they faded into the distance. Ethan joked that he could have been a ghost, already trying to lighten the mood. I laughed, but there was something about this place. Something old, watching, waiting. The storm outside grew worse, and after we had settled into our room, the windows rattled violently in their frames. The ocean below, which we had glimpsed briefly on the drive, was an endless black void, roaring and crashing with terrifying power. It felt as though the mansion itself teetered on the brink of the cliff, ready to be swallowed by the sea at any moment. It wasn't until after dinner that things truly began to feel wrong. Ethan and I sat by the fire in the drawing room, enjoying the warmth, listening to the sound of the storm. I was the first to notice it, a faint sound barely audible over the wind, a tapping, soft but insistent, as if someone or something was knocking at the window. "Ethan, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice hushed. He frowned, listening, and then it came again, tap, tap, tap. We both turned toward the window, but it was impossible to see anything beyond the rain-soaked glass. Ethan said that it was probably just a branch, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The tapping continued, louder, more insistent. We stood, both of us staring into the dark, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then suddenly the door to the drawing room creaked open. We turned as one, our hearts pounding. The hallway beyond was dark, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move, something shifting in the gloom. "Who's there?" Ethan called, stepping toward the door. There was no answer. I grabbed his arm. "Don't!" But he went, disappearing into the hallway. I stayed frozen, my eyes locked on the open doorway, expecting him to return at any moment. But the seconds stretched on, the storm outside growing louder, and Ethan didn't come back. I called his name, my voice shaking. There was no response. The mansion felt suffocating, its stone walls pressing in around me. The shadows seemed to move, as though something unseen lurked just out of sight, watching, waiting. Finally, I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan?" My voice echoed through the empty corridors. The house was utterly still, save for the wind and rain outside. And then faintly from the end of the hallway, I heard his voice. "Sarah?" It was a whisper, so soft I could barely hear it. but it was him. I rushed toward the sound, my bare feet slipping on the cold stone floors. "Ethan!" I reached the end of the hallway, where a door stood slightly ajar. The sound of the storm seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. I pushed the door open. It was a small, dark room, lit only by a single flickering candle on the far wall. And there, in the corner, stood Ethan, or something that looked like Ethan. He was facing the wall, his back to me, his body rigid. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Slowly, too slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes, God, his eyes. They were hollow, empty, as though the person I had married was gone, replaced by something else, something dark. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth far too sharp. "Sarah," he whispered again, but the voice was no longer his. It was a low, guttural rasp, like something deep in the earth, something ancient and evil. I screamed, stumbling backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows in the room seemed to close in, swirling around him, consuming him. And then he lunged at me. I ran screaming back to our room. I don't know how I got away from him. For now I'm barricaded inside, but I can still hear him in the hall. I can hear him scratching at the door, growling and whispering my name. I don't know what's happened to Ethan. I don't know what he is now, but I know I won't survive the night.